All right, so we are live now. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone present in today's session. I, Pragnya Panda, welcome you to the Stories of Beliefs and Social Customs, curated under TMYS Review, June 2022, in collaboration with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Professor Sarah M. Pike, Professor Bron Taylor, and Professor Kimberly Carfore, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic of today's discussion is the effect of ritualistic practices on the environment under the sub-theme Festivities and Ritualistic Practices. All of them are experts in this area with many years of professional experience. So before we start today's discussion, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for tonight is Dr. Sarah M. Pike, who is a professor of comparative religion at California State University, Chico. She has written numerous books and articles on contemporary paganism, ritual, the New Age movement, Burning Man, festivals, spiritual dance, environmentalism, the ancestral skills movement, and climate protests. Her most recent book is For the Wild, Ritual and Commitment in Radical Eco-Activism. Her current research focuses on ritualized relationships with landscapes after wildfires. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our second speaker for tonight is Professor Bron Taylor, who is an interdisciplinary environmental studies scholar whose research and writing explore through the lenses of the sciences and humanities the complex relationships between religion, ecology, ethics, and the quest for sustainability. His books include Dark Green Religion, Nature Spirituality, and the Planetary Future, 2010, Avatar and Nature Spirituality, 2013, and Ecological Resistance Movements, 1995. He is also the editor of the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, 2005, and the Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. He is a professor of religion and nature at the University of Florida and a fellow of the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Study in Munich, Germany. In 2017, he was recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. We welcome you, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Nice to be with you.
Our third speaker for tonight is Professor Kimberly Carfore, who teaches in both the Environmental Studies and Theology and Religious Studies departments at the University of San Francisco. She serves as co-chair for the Religion and Ecology Unit of the American Academy of Religion and is on the advisory board for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology for Eco-Justice and Ecofeminism. Her most recent publication is in the Sage Journal of Feminist Theology, titled Ecofeminist Theology, Intersectional Justice, and Plumwood's Philosophical Animism. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us this evening.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So now we open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Professor Pike to begin. Ma'am, over to you now. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Just trying to find my unmute button. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I do have a few slides I'd like to share because I'm going to be talking about some practices that are very visual. So if we could do that, that would be great. All right. Can rituals save the planet? My current research is on rituals involved with ecological restoration after climate-related disasters and on certain kinds of protests, such as climate strikes, recent protests. And in both cases, I really want to explore how these rituals are effective or might be effective at changing human attitudes and practices towards the environment. Today, I'm really going to focus on climate strikes and not really talk about the restoration rituals, but they are related in my recent research. In an essay he wrote in 2002, Performance is Currency in the Deep World's Gift Economy, ritual theorist Ronald Grimes argues that too much environmental activism focuses on ethical principles. Rather, Grimes says, and here he's following the poet Gary Snyder, he says that it's really performance that is the currency we should be using to address our current environmental crises. We should be trying to figure out what actions, rightly performed, might save the planet. So that's his language that I'm really borrowing from here. So focusing on climate strikers through their ritualized protest activities like road blockades or funerals for endangered species that I'm going to show you, they're really drawing on the potential efficacy of ritual and performance. In my book, For the Wild, that Pragnya mentioned, I focused on how ritualized protests enact particular kinds of relationships, realities, and ideals in reference to the earth and to other species. And in this, I really want to put forward that environmental protests both express and create relationships among humans and between humans and non-humans. And this is where we might see some of the efficacy of these rituals. So I'm going to share some examples of climate protests from 2018 to 2021, especially the youth-led Fridays for Future climate strikes and Extinction Rebellion protests that started in 2018 and then spread around the world. So here you see a slide of Greta Thunberg, and this is, she's really credited with starting the recent youth-led climate protests, and they began in 2018 when she was in 9th grade at the time, and she sat outside the Swedish parliament holding this sign that read "School Strike for Climate." On the second day that she was out there, other students joined her, and then 6 months later, over 1 million students took part in these school strikes where they walked out of school and into the streets. And this really happened. It spread to almost all continents and many different countries around the world. And they walked out carrying signs like "Save our future," "You will die of old age," "We will die of climate change." And then, of course, in 2020, COVID-19 shut down everything, and they just started up again last year. So here last fall at the COP26, the Conference for Parties in Glasgow, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, there was this, what I would argue is an increase in democratic participation by those that are often invisible or left out of the process. So here we have young people, teenagers and young adults leading these marches, indigenous presence, which I won't go into in any detail today. I really want to focus on the youth, but really the participation and visibility of people that are not often visible in the kind of global political process. So this was last fall in Glasgow. And then I want to suggest that these recent climate strikes that bring young people forward as actors on the world political stage show their bodies acting together and really bringing a vision of a different future into public awareness. They're seizing, in a sense, and then reconfiguring public space that's often identified with empire and progress, and the way things have always been done by industrialized nations and corporate powers. So they're suggesting by their very presence an alternative. And of course, these are young people whose very bodies, their very presence in space suggests the future that hopefully they're going to be living and what that future will bring, and really insisting that they have a voice in that. So some of the climate protests, and especially Extinction Rebellion, have engaged these funerals for extinct and endangered species. These are from 2018 and 2019, the ones I'm showing you. And here, I think what's really interesting is the ways in which activists are identifying with other species, vulnerable species or species that are already gone. So they're making these losses visible in public space in a way that they are often invisible. So they have these funeral processions where they're identifying with other animals, and then these die-ins on the left here with the Grim Reaper, where they're, really making very visible the possible future or the probable future in terms of extinctions. So these often invisible others, endangered animals, for example, are brought into public view when activist bodies assemble in the streets, referencing the lives and the suffering of these others. And we'll see some examples in just a second of the fake blood that's spilled to kind of symbolize this suffering of other animals in particular. And what they're really asking for is, or what they're putting on or showcasing here, is their own ultimate values: the integrity of the planet, the right to a livable future, the value of all species facing extinction. So there's really three themes I want to emphasize: this kind of visibility of what's often invisible, the identification of activists with other species, which then suggests certain kinship, relationships, and connections that they are enacting by wearing masks, by holding funerals, and then the ways in which they're occupying public spaces. and making these public spaces into sacred spaces of mourning for the present and the future dead. And one of the best examples of this, I think, is in the Extinction Rebellion's Red Rebel Brigade, which you see on the right here. And on the left are the Blue Rebels, and these are a Scotland-based group, but the Red Rebels are have performed in different countries around the world, and these are performance artists who come to these protests. And the Red Rebels, their slogan for this is in the COP26 last fall in Scotland, that it's code red for humanity, for climate, and for nature. And the Blue Rebels are embodying the threat of sea level rise, of course, in an island nation like Britain, and particularly along the coast of Scotland here. So I'm going to show you a couple other examples of the Red Rebels. Here they are as part of a street protest. This is in England. And at this protest, I wanted to read just a couple of quotes. You get this sense of identification that they are trying to embody with other species, and again, bringing the suffering of other species into the public realm. They say that their red attire symbolizes the common blood we share with all species. And this is a quote from the Red Rebels. It also symbolizes the blood that will be spilled in the future. And then let me show you another example of this. This was on Earth Day last year. This is in England and Poland. And one flyer that was handed out during their performance read as follows: "We are your blood, that of our planet, the blood of all extinguishing species, of our burning forests, our dying oceans, our polluted rivers. We are the blood of all the past and future casualties of climate, of the war against the planet. We mourn our losses now to help you awaken." So it's this help you awaken part where I think there's some possibility for efficacy in these performances to really change not only the protesters themselves, the participants, but those who are viewing them. All right, let's see. So just a couple other examples here. So also from last year around the COP, this was the Camino to COP, and this is a group of Extinction Rebellion protesters, the Faith Bridge. It's an interfaith group. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, except to really point out the way in which they were extending the space of protest by making this pilgrimage. So they started in London and they walked to Glasgow, and it lasted 56 days. So carrying these banners, marching with their bodies across the landscape to draw attention to these issues so with the intention of changing themselves, transforming the participants, but also changing the hearts of the people, the hearts and minds of the people that witnessed their pilgrimage across the landscape. So the final example that I want to give you, well, there are really two examples, but is the way that the youth-led climate strikes really reconfigured public spaces of global power. And this was, these are both from 2019. These Extinction Rebellion protesters were part of the youth-led Fridays for Climate movement. They claimed the Westminster Alliance. So here we are in London, in Westminster, the center of the British Empire, really, the center of power, where they did some road blockades and other kinds of protests. This is also a central tourist destination. So really going for the optimal effect here in terms of public visibility. That same year, this was another Extinction Rebellion protest. This is in Wall Street in the United States. And here we have blood again, or the sense of the blood that's shared with those that are suffering. And I'll just read you a quote from one of the organizers for this. He says, "The blood of the world is here. The fossil fuel industry is directly connected to the financial interests of Wall Street." So here, these bodies of protesters acting together on these city streets in front of powerful political and economic institutions, they're really trying to transform these public, secular, political spaces into sacred spaces. And here's the bull that symbolizes the economic might of Wall Street being reconfigured into an object or a participant really in the protest. So these activists lying with blood on their bodies are trying to occupy these spaces of state power and demanding a response. So through these ritualized processes of walking out of schools and into the streets, of holding funerals for extinct species, performances that claim public space and reconfigure its meaning, these protesters themselves are transformed at the same time that they aim to transform the broader public that sees and witnesses their actions in person, or perhaps maybe later watches them on a computer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your valuable insights and for that lovely presentation. I would now request Professor Taylor to share his views and perspectives with us. So over to you.
It's nice to be here, and this is something of a lead into the lecture you've just heard from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. I have basically 5 points to make, and I'll probably only get to 4. Religious rituals sometimes promote human adaptation to their environments. Speaking generally, ethnobiologists, anthropologists, and others have documented how, for many indigenous societies, religious mores and related religious practices, including some forms of ritualizing, promote ecosystem health. 2 famous studies I'll mention are the study by Marvin Harris, titled originally The Myth of the Sacred Cow, in which he argued that the cow became sacred in South Asian religion because, to put it simply, given the ways of life that evolved there, they were worth more alive than dead. Specifically, he argued that cow poop was essential fertilizer for the region's agriculture and their milk a valuable food source. Therefore, myths that make them sacred and prohibit people from killing them have helped to make the agro-ecosystems of South Asia sustainable, and this in turn has enhanced the ability of people to survive and reproduce. This was a decisively important theory that suggested that religions emerge and evolve in ways that promote not only pro-social behavior, but also behavior that protects ecosystems. In this case, the agro-ecosystems upon which people depend. Soon afterward, the anthropologist Roy Rappaport published Pigs for the Ancestors. In it, he analyzed rituals among the Tsimbaga Maring of New Guinea. For this tribe, religious ritual that typically took place during times of warfare and involved the slaughter of pigs, which was both to appease the gods while also contributing to the end of the warfare, while also reducing pig populations to numbers within the carrying capacity of the ecosystem that the tribe depended on. The ritual thereby regulated the ecosystem in a way that prevented ecosystem degradation while also providing food for the tribe. These studies alert us to how religions and their ritual practices can and sometimes do co-evolve with human cultures in ways that are socially and ecologically adaptive, and that promote the health and resilience of ecosystems upon which humans and other organisms depend. But Harris and Rappaport also recognize that religions and rituals can also be maladaptive, and this leads to my second point, that indeed religious rituals often hinder human adaptation to their environments. I spent much of my career examining the role of the world's religions to assess whether and under what circumstances they promote healthy biocultural systems. And I regret to say that, generally speaking, world religions have been slow to develop pro-environmental priorities because there are ideas and practices endemic to them that hinder their ability to do so. Now, many of you know about the famous article by the historian Lynn White, which played a major role in precipitating the field of interdisciplinary environmental studies. He argued that 2 central aspects of Christianity contributed decisively to environmentally destructive attitudes and behaviors, and his critiques also apply equally to Judaism and Islam. First, the belief that only humans are created in the image of God, therefore humans have superior moral value to other living things. Secondly, the prohibition on idolatry, namely worshiping anything other than God. And this led to the suppression of nature-based spirituality, such as paganism and animism. This often also involved the forced conversion of people with such spiritual beliefs, as well as the destruction of sacred groves and other places and practices important to them. More generally, White made this assertion: since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. Despite his critique of Orthodox Christianity, White thought there had been and were versions of the tradition that could be used as a foundation for green Christianity. Moreover, like others then and now, he thought that Buddhism and animistic spiritualities were naturally more eco-friendly. Although White did not initiate the view that Abrahamic religions promulgate environmentally destructive beliefs and behaviors, his critique was advanced in a widely disseminated journal just as environmental alarm was spreading. And this led to soul searching not only among Christians, but among religionists from diverse traditions. And this soul searching led some thinkers to search their traditions for environmentally friendly themes and to argue that, properly understood, their religions should enjoin conservation. Now, I've been following up on such claims, and in 2016, with two others, I published what then and now is the most comprehensive review of research into religion and environmental behavior. And we found that those with profound environmental concerns within the so-called world religions remain a distinct minority. When it comes to environmental understanding and values, religiosity is typically less important than other variables, such as political ideology and educational levels. All world religions, whether they emerged on the Indian subcontinent or the Near East, have themes and dynamics, we found, that include understandings of how environmental systems work, and this tends to hinder environmental concern and pro-environmental behavior. Why? Well, broad themes hinder environmental mobilization by participants in world religions, including the belief that a deity or deities control nature. This is one of the ideas that can include understanding of human impacts on environmental systems. Based on such beliefs, whether nature is harmful or beneficent is typically related to whether an individual group is properly aligned with God or the gods, and whether people are properly carrying out their religious duties. Consequently, to ensure favorable environment, one must appease or please the deities, any deities powerful enough to influence nature. And commonly, ritual sacrifices of plants and animals are considered to be a way to appease or please the nature-influencing divinity. Sometimes those who are believed to be offending the deity must also be converted or suppressed in some way. Given such beliefs, religious people often find it difficult to imagine that negative environmental change, including catastrophic climate change, can result from human behaviors, unless those behaviors involve disloyalty to the deity or violate some religious obligation. Secondly, world religions in their mainstreams are all deeply anthropocentric. They promote the notion that humans are exceptional. And with few exceptions, they typically assume that humans are of greater moral value than other life forms. For the Abrahamic religions, there's the idea that only humans are created in God's image and that they are to be regents or stewards over all other living things. For the Dharma traditions, human beings are believed to have achieved the highest spiritual pinnacle short of enlightenment. And I surmise that this perception of superiority erodes identification with and empathy for other species. Thirdly, world religions tend to devalue this world by envisioning divine rescue from it in some way, either by promising an extra-planetary post-death home or transcendence from this world and its travails through spiritual practices or meritorious reincarnations. Third main point, many religious rituals directly harm environmental systems and their inhabitants, human and not. And here I could go into a lot of detail, just looking at particular religious practices. For example, Christian commemorations of Jesus requiring huge amounts of palm fronds, which are eroding the habitat for endangered species. Practices in Taoist temples burning joss paper, which leads to tremendous pollution. Fireworks, which are heavily polluting and connected, entangled with religious rituals in many societies, including in South Asia. The pollution precipitated by hundreds of millions of people traveling to religious services, including the Hajj in Mecca. Pollute ocean, lake, and river pollution by Hindus during the festival honoring the elephant god Ganesh, in which millions of people release toxic statues into river bodies and so forth. So I could go on and on with those sorts of things, but I want to get to my fourth point. And this is really the kickoff to Sarah's argument. New forms of religion and ritualizing are needed to promote pro-environmental perceptions, emotions, values, and priorities. And these are unfolding in a host of often unrecognized ways. Put simply, rituals are understood to involve repeated practices that are designed to focus attention on whatever people consider to be sacred, in other words, of ultimate value. The sacred is typically associated with transformative, if not also transcendent power and extraordinary experiences, which also involves personal and community healing. As environmental alarm has grown, so have many forms of earth-venerating ritual. In my opinion, if we want to focus on the potential of ritualizing to positively impact biocultural systems, we need to broaden the horizon of what we consider to be pro-environmental ritualizing. Yes, festivals such as those surrounding Earth Day, but exactly the kinds of things that Sarah was talking about, environmental protests, Newly invented ritual practices, such as the Council of All Beings, which I don't have a chance to talk about now, but which is the examples that Sarah gave are kind of an echo of that process that was developed decades ago. But I think we also need to focus not just on the kinds of things that we typically consider to be ritual practices, but what about pilgrimages to nature reserves and practices there that cultivate alertness to the liveliness and value of the living world? What about pilgrimages to science museums, aquariums, and art exhibitions? Watching documentary and theatrical films together, reading poetry and novels, which were produced in part to awaken felt kinship with non-human organisms, just as Sarah was talking about in the rituals that she focused on. Now, these are the types of social phenomena that I've written about at length, including in Dark Green Religion, Nature Spirituality, and the Planetary Future, and that I will continue to pay strict attention to in the second edition of that, as well as a book I hope to do on science museums and aquariums and art exhibitions. So that's my riff. I think I'm just in time. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable insights. I would now request Professor Carfore to share her views with us. Over to you, ma'am.
Wonderful. Thanks again. It's such an honor to be here with such amazing scholars. So thank you for organizing this. So my talk will focus on this idea of ritual, the ritual of being in nature, right? It's a very simple ritual. And to some extent, it's double clicking on Braun's fourth point, right? That pilgrimages in nature can create a sense of connection or oneness with the natural world, which then can kind of resonate and have a ripple effect, right? And so in particular, I'm going to talk about my experience in outdoor education, right? So leading youth and young adults into these types of pilgrimages, which have also been known as potentially a rites of passage, right? So Arnold van Gennep talks about rites of passage, where encountering the natural world, you have a preliminal phase, a liminal, and then a post-liminal, right? So the preliminal in this classroom is day one, introductions, how to prepare to be in nature. You're going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be cold. Here's the weather. Here's how to keep yourself safe. The liminal is being in the natural world, being in an uncomfortable situation, and then learning how to keep yourself safe, learn a lot about yourself, keep yourself warm, etc. And then the post-liminal, which is our end of the semester presentations, how we talk about certain things, some epiphanies that we might have had. Okay, and so in particular, I've been teaching this class called Nature Immersion at the University of San Francisco for about 5 years now. And so all these classes are taught outdoors. And the goal is to connect with nature and also connect with a deeper sense of oneself, right? A part of yourself that might be hidden when you're existing within the structures of modern day civilization, right? And so the University of San Francisco is a Jesuit institution, so a Catholic institution, which focuses on the idea of cura personalis, right? So care for the whole person, your mind, body, and your spirit. So in typical education, the body and the spirit can get left out, right? Because there's so much focus on the mind. And so in this class in particular, I tend to try to teach to the emotional and the spiritual body as well, okay? And so before I taught this, I taught for about 4 years as a wilderness field instructor. And so I learned a lot about myself and human beings in general through this work of taking youth and young adults out into the natural world. There's lots of time to reflect in nature. There's lots of stillness in nature. And there's lots of moments of being uncomfortable. You can't hide from yourself in the natural world, in the wilderness. And so I think those are some of the areas where a lot of this education happens. And so one thing that I hear often from my students is this phrase, I feel so small. When I'm in nature, I feel so small. So whether that's after they, summited a 4,000 elevation mountain, or they sleep under a sky full of stars, or we sit over and view the Pacific Ocean, these things that are vast and open and big. And I think that this experience of smallness, this reflects that in the natural world, they're connecting to something bigger than themselves, right? And so I think that is very much a spiritual and a religious point. They realize that they're not necessarily in charge, whereas in modern day civilization, it's easy to feel like you're in charge of your life and everything, right? There's this sense of control that you have. And so a lot of this comes from being in the city surrounded by man-made objects, whether that's how much we live on our phones or our computers, or going to our jobs and we have our busy schedules and I wear this nice suit and I feel so big and so important. But when I'm facing a big snowstorm or a thunderstorm, I realize how unimportant I might be, right? And so these things that in our everyday life we take to be so important, they matter very much to our egoic selves. But in nature, you realize that there's a different part of ourselves, right? Our ecological selves. And so these things kind of fall to the wayside when we're in nature. Especially when you're out in the middle of nowhere and you just have your backpack and your tent, right? Your tent is very permeable. So if there's any sort of windstorm, especially at nighttime, or you might hear a coyote with your storm, the fear kicks in, right? And so the animal instincts will kick in, a different aspect of ourselves that can communicate to us certain aspects of wisdom that are connected to the wisdom in the natural world. So one event in particular that this definitely happened, Professor Pike, you might recognize this, but in October of 2021 here in California, we had this torrential rainstorm, right? So it was an atmospheric river meets a bomb cyclone, right? And I took my my students, we were scheduled to have an overnight, and so we did that. And in the middle of this farm agriculture area, we were camping, and by the end of the storm, no one had a dry item left, right? And we were pretty much miserable the whole time, but in that misery, there was so much raw emotion and a sense of building community. Even though there was a lot of fear, there were lots of smiling and so much laughter. And so, you know, ultimately, this was an encounter with the real, right? So I say real with a capital R. And so this reality, the real, is something that philosophers utter when they talk about this encounter with God, right? And so I think this encounter occurs when people end up working towards a common goal. And in this event in particular, it was an unspoken common goal, right? And so it was our common survival as a group. It wasn't an abstract concept. It was survival. And so in Western society, especially, you know, modern techno-industrial culture, this encounter with the real can be a rare encounter. And so, for example, if we're uncomfortable in civilization, all we have to do is turn up the heater or turn on the air conditioning. Or if we're on social media, we see something we don't like, we'll just scroll to the next post, right? And so we don't necessarily tap into this level of being or existing because these devices and these structures wall us off from experiencing or encountering the real in this way. And so this encounter is something that German theologian Rudolf Otto has, he's called it the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. Okay, so Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans, that is the mystery before which both humans tremble and they are fascinated, right? So there is this experience of being repelled from and attracted to this encounter. And so it combines both these ideas of the light and the dark, the good and the bad. And so in this encounter, this experience with the real, a holy other can be experienced as wrathful and also as awe-inspiring, okay? And so this encounter with the numinous, as I mentioned, is an encounter with the holy other. This is categorically different than any ordinary encounter that we can have in our modern day civilization, okay? And so while I've already applied this concept to nature, specifically in our experience being immersed in the torrential downpour, this can also be experienced when the students see a beautiful sunset or a sky full of stars. I had a student who saw her first shooting star for the first time in her life, and that's because she lived in the city her whole life. And so that experience of awe and wonder opened her up to this other world that didn't exist in her worldview before that experience. And so, as I've mentioned, this encounter with the numinous, it can align your mind, body, and your spirit, and it can reveal to you your place in the cosmological order of things, okay? And so learning to be in nature is learning to be with yourself. It's learning to be uncomfortable, but you don't necessarily have to have this John Muir adventure of climbing a mountain, right? I think that learning the history of the land that you stand on is also a ritualistic experience, which will probably also make you uncomfortable, right? Because especially here in America, where the genocide of Native Americans is the founding story of much of the land that we encounter. You can also learn about the flora and fauna in your area. I find that especially during the pandemic, when my nature immersion class had to go online, most of my curriculum ended up being just go wherever you are, learn your place, learn about the evolutionary history, the geology, the bird calls, the different native and non-native plant species in your area. And so in that sense, while you're learning about the plants that surround you, you can start seeing them as kin, right? Because it's just learning about your neighbors. They're just neighbors that speak a different language than you, right? And so learning about yourself and your place, and especially your place in the cosmological order, this becomes not a transcendent category, but a lived and material experience in this world, right? That's very important. And so I'm just going to end with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, because like I said, this talk has been a lot about my experience with outdoor experiential education. And he actually has a lot to say about the future of educational institutions, right? Including outdoor education. And so he says, if you want to lead a young person on the right path of education, be careful not to disturb his, and don't mind the gendered language, we'll give him a pass. Don't disturb his naively trustful and personally immediate relationship with nature. The meadow and the mountainside must speak to him in their own tongues. At the same time, he must recognize himself in them as in countless dispersed reflexes and reflections, and in a multicolored whirl of changing appearances. In this way, he will unconsciously sympathize with the metaphysical oneness of all things in the great metaphor of nature. And there's definitely a lot of research coming out talking about how being in the natural world will open up paths of empathy with both human and non-humans. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. That was indeed wonderful. So now we move to the question and answer section. And my first question is to Professor Pike. Ma'am, in your book, For the Wild, Ritual and Commitment in Radical Eco-Activism, you have identified ritual as a key element in the structuring of environmental protest, sustaining motivation and shaping identity. Can you please share with us how rituals are able to perform these tasks?
So in my book, I try to respond to the question of how does a young person come to be at an environmental protest, especially one that might involve dangerous actions that can result in imprisonment or injury. So if you're blockading a street, you may get dragged away and put in jail. Or when they're locked to heavy equipment to prevent an oil pipeline being constructed, or if they're sitting up high in a redwood tree to keep that tree from being cut down. So I was really interested to find out, how does someone get there, and why do they stay, and why do they keep coming back to these dangerous protests often? So I framed these kinds of actions as ritualized because of the particular kind of focus and intention that's brought to them, as well as their repetitive nature. And these protests express certain kinds of relationships between humans and trees, or humans and endangered species, or humans and other humans that are going to, you know, bear the consequences of the oil pipeline, for example. And these relationships with the more than human world then shape human identities, and especially because these are young adults who are, you know, their identities are still being profoundly formed by these experiences. And I would say, in a sense, what Kimberly just referred to as the ecological selves are developing in participating in these protests.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your answer. My second question is to you that each religion values animals differently. While some people view animals as sacred based on the religion they follow, others merely see them as a source of food. Why do you think that happens?
Well, I think Braun really spoke exactly to this point, so I won't go into too much depth with the world religions, but I will make a couple of comments about this. The climate strikes, well, the climate strikes, in a sense, show that importance of this kind of identification with other animals, and I think that is often has not been the case in many cultures. So this is a really complicated question because, of course, human practices, such as the treatment of non-human animals, they're shaped by history, economics, politics, and other cultural forces, as well as religion. So even if people follow a religion which has some teachings about the sacredness of animals, or at the very least, the responsibilities of humans to be the caretaker of animals, these are ideals and they don't often reflect actual practice. And again, I'll refer back to Braun's comments about the kind of research he and his colleagues did to find that these are really minorities within the world's traditions that would see these, for instance, as relationships of kin or relationships of beings that deserve equal ethical and moral consideration. So some within these religions might adhere to these teachings, but others might be affected by opposing cultural forces or by economic necessity. And even when animals are seen as sacred, and I'm thinking of some of the indigenous traditions where, you know, in the area where I live, they are also become a source of food. So becoming a source of food doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't seen as kin or aren't seen as sacred. So again, this is a really complicated issue. And I guess the question for me is how to reduce the suffering of non-human animals. So as a philosopher friend of mine who specializes in animal ethics argues, even strict vegans are only aspirational. Animals are killed in agricultural practices involved with growing vegetables. So really deaths and suffering are largely unavoidable. So I'll just end it there because I know we have other questions for other folks on the panel.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your valuable perspective. I would now like to ask my questions to Professor Taylor. So, sir, as you mentioned about the immersion of Ganesha in Hindu rituals, I would like to ask you that people use sacred water in rituals irrespective of their origin, residence, and other socio-economic variables. Water is a sign and symbol of sacredness to religious rituals, while polluted water is harmful to good health. Why do people understand this difference yet choose to ignore it?
Well, there's been some good research on this, and if a water body is a god or a goddess, it's just hard for a lot of folks to get their brain around the idea that a mere pipsqueak human could harm that goddess. So that's pretty well documented in the ethnographic literature, actually. I think part of the big question is, for generations now, humans have been developing an ecological and an evolutionary worldview. And as part of that, they've also been developing a field known as ethology, the study of animal consciousness and behavior. All of these things have reinforced scientifically that we are quite literally kin, biologically related in a very deep way. And of course, the world's predominant religions did not evolve to create sustainable ecosystems or biocultural systems. They evolved, generally speaking, thousands of years ago. So it's not surprising that they would have those kinds of perceptions deeply ingrained in them. Liberal forms of religions, which are largely kind of elite sectors of those traditions tend to be able to graft these more scientific understandings onto their tradition, in part because their epistemology their hermeneutic is that you are always going to be cherry picking your tradition, and that's okay for a liberal. You can decide which parts still make sense today, and then you can incorporate stuff from other religious traditions and from science, and you can integrate these in new ways. The problem really adheres more to people with a kind of conservative religious epistemology that reifies, as Roy Rappaport put, the ultimate sacred postulates into forms that cannot change and they cannot adapt. So folks in the Hindu tradition who are alarmed, like many of us are, about the current climate crisis and the extinction crisis and so forth. That's a tradition that's really quite malleable theoretically to incorporate these different dynamics, but the roots of these things are very deep. And one of the roots of the world's predominant religions that really needs to be discussed and understood more is that these are agricultures. And so they tend to prioritize the kinds of species that humans rely on for their food and fodder and sustenance. So they tend to not to have negative attitudes toward species that are predators on our food sources, like wolves, like animals we call pests that eat our vegetables. So in part what we need is this kind of radical religious reformation where we incorporate these kinship spiritualities and these metaphysics of interconnection and belonging, and we figure out if we're within a religious tradition, we figure out how to incorporate those. But for a lot of folks, we just decide that that's just really hard to do. So let's just create a meaning system rooted on the real world as best we understand it, including through the lenses of science. And humans are meaning-seeking creatures, so they're going to keep doing that whether they have a traditional religious infrastructure or not. And that's part of what I write about in the Dark Green Religion book. In part, these naturalistic forms of meaning-seeking, where people are arriving at pro-environmental values, experimenting with pro-environmental ritualizing in ways that seek to awaken and deepen our felt connections to nature.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your answer. My second question to you is, how exactly do you think growth in the importance of religion might translate to climate policy and the future evolution of the climate system that is yet to be seen?
Well, I think the kinds of things that Sarah was talking about speak to the power of the potential of newfound and newfangled ritualizing. I mean, most people have little experience with the kind of affective experiences and the cognitive understandings that are animating these activists. And there's been efforts for really since Earth Day to move these kinds of things forward. What is, in my judgment, encouraging about Extinction Rebellion and the climate strikes and so forth is that and the DAPL resistance is that these movements now are gaining greater cultural traction than their the earlier generation that was being equally creative, but it was still from a pretty small base. And I think as the science becomes more obvious that we're in a heap of trouble environmentally, there's more people being drawn to these things. And so I think that the seed bed for new forms of ritualizing that have been planted for a generation and a half or so, including by folks in your bioregion, Kimberly, Joanna Macy and her progeny and so forth, have been tremendously influential in getting at what Sarah's been talking about, which is rituals of mourning and resistance. So, I mean, it's still hard to envision and to be optimistic that the groundswell of such forces will be up to the task of reversing the current truly apocalyptic trend. But if there is a religion-related possibility of contributing to the amelioration of this unfolding catastrophe, I think these are some of the things that might contribute to it.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir.
You
So
bet.
now I would now like to ask my questions to Professor Carfore. So, ma'am, spirituality is often thought to be about personal growth and gaining a proper understanding of one's place in the cosmos, and to be intertwined with the environmentalistic concern and action. This contrasts markedly with the world's predominant religions, which are generally concerned with transcending this world or obtaining divine rescue from it. So, can you share your views on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So, in terms of religion and spirituality, you have to understand that definitions of these terms are contingent upon which particular religion you're referring to, and also specifically what the cultural context is that these religions are being practiced in. So, for example, Christianity tends to have this interest in this otherworldly transcendence, which is particularly why people believe that, well, if a God is all powerful, then God will fix climate change, right? I think there's a big gap in terms of that, right? But there are also some sects of Christianity that are concerned with these issues. I'm thinking in particularly ecofeminist theologies, also Christian social teachings, which are very concerned with social justice issues, liberation theologies as well. And so I think finding certain sects of these religions can offer us a lot of wisdom to help give us some tools to deal with a current climate crisis. And then if you think about, Buddhism, once again, as it has been adopted into the West, it's been critiqued, some sects of it, for particularly people call it navel gazing, right? So if you aren't connecting it to the material world, that's what's important, right? You can draw spirituality from these religions, but what is it doing to help feed your social justice concerns or addressing the ecological crisis, right? So we have to be careful not to extract these spiritualities from the religions and then not have them have these ecological implications, right? And so when I think about spiritualities, I like to think about spirituality in terms of it's not just in here, right? The ecological self doesn't have a separate inner and outer world, right? The outer world is tied to the inner world, right? And so spiritualities in terms of material practices, I think, is a really important way to look at this.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your answer. My second question to you is, the focus of ethics in the world's religions has been largely human-centered. Human treatment of humans is often seen not only as an end in itself, but also as a means to eternal reward. Do you agree that this is narrow in light of environmental degradation and loss of species?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. The focus of ethics in the world's religions has been largely human centered. Humane treatment of humans is often seen not only as an end in itself, but also as a means to eternal reward. Do you agree that this is narrow in light of environmental degradation and the loss of species?
Yes, absolutely. So the term anthropocentrism is important here, right? That a lot of religions have been anthropocentric. I think Braun brought up a really good point that you have to think about the context. Whenever you think of the term religion or spirituality, you have to think about the context, right? And so these Abrahamic religions arose through an agricultural context. And so when you read scripture and it says, the snake is evil or this animal is evil, it's because of survival at that moment had to do with their ties to agriculture. And so opening up, right? And so now our current context includes these social justice concerns, especially the ecological crisis and the climate crisis. And so we now have to reevaluate and reconstruct our religious scriptures and institutions and doctrines, practices, and rituals to include our current context, which is addressing the ecological crisis.
Thank you so much for your answer, ma'am. So with that, we come to an end to today's discussion. It is very unfortunate that Professor Armin Rosencranz couldn't join us today due to unavoidable circumstances. Thank you to each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure that our live audience that is watching this on Facebook had a wonderful time as well. I thank you all for taking out time from your extremely busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion organized on the TMYS platform. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Yeah,
Thank you
absolutely.
for having me. Thanks for inviting me. And it was great to see everybody.
Absolutely.
It was great to see you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are all obliged. The TMYS team is obliged to have you all. Thank you.
Hasta la vista.
Bye.